first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Ravina Claxton. I'm the principal at North Shore HR Consulting. It's my own business I've had for about 5 years now. Been up in Cook County a little over 5 years. But before that, I've had a wide variety of HR roles as VP and director and manager in nonprofit healthcare, some large hospitals, and worked with a lot of small businesses and a variety of different kinds of businesses. So probably what's most important to you today is to know that I've done this before. And back in, I believe it was 2017, I was working in a large hospital in the Twin Cities when they adopted the sick and safe statutes in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I've also written policies for Duluth when they passed theirs for employers in Duluth. So I have a variety of experiences in not only writing policies, but implementing and then the questions, which there's all kinds of questions that come along with these statutes. So that's what we'll concentrate on today. My goal is for you to leave here with your basic questions answered, fundamental understanding what the statute's all about. And I want to make it as easy as possible for you to think through how you're going to implement it in your business. I'm going to share some stories from some other clients, because I have clients that have just a variety of sizes. They have sick time, they have PTO, they have unions. And so I want to share some of those experiences with you today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Pat.
I'm Pat Campanero, and I'm happy to see all of you. I think I've worked with most of you. If I haven't, I want you to know I'm a small business consultant. My services are free to you. I work through the Northland Foundation and the Small Business Administration on the federal level. So I can help with almost anything that you need in small business development, not because I'm brilliant, but I have a great network who helps me provide all the answers for you. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to have Ravina start this with us. There are some new rules that are coming down from the legislature that are going to affect us all. This is the first one that's going to be affected. In your binders are copies of the slides and all of the materials we're going to talk about today, so you have something to take home and reference. And we welcome, after this session, other questions, because we're pretty sure that we'll probably have more of these sessions as we go on. Go ahead, Ravina. Thank you.
And we'll probably answer your questions along the way. But if you have something that's just a burning question that you cannot get any further without getting the answer out on the question out on the table, do stop me, okay? All right. So the first thing I want to say to you up front is that this is new. I remember back in the day in the 90s when family medical leave and some other major federal laws were passed. There are a lot of questions. It takes a few years to work out all of the details and some of the issues, okay? So in some cases, I'm going to share a couple of questions here with you today that I've actually gotten different answers on, depending on who you talk to at the state, okay? So we're going to concentrate on the intent, what the law actually says, the interpretations that you may have to make along the way. But I want to tell you this, I don't think as long as you are doing the basics that the state is going to come in and smack you on the hands for having some finer point not completely, okay? Because this is a little bit of an evolving issue or statute. But at the same time, I think everyone needs to understand that they need to be compliant to it or implement it, because there are pretty stiff penalties associated with it. So by introduction here, I would like to do a little brief poll so I can kind of understand where you are in the room. All right. So, and on Zoom, if you would raise your little hand flag so we can understand where you're coming from. Which statement describes you best? And so raise your hand depending on the statement. I've been to at least one presentation on ESST, but I left more confused than when I started. Okay, well that's good. This is my first training on the subject, but I've been reading about it. Okay, cool. What's ESSD? It's okay, it's okay. All right, and I currently offer no paid time off, no paid time off. Okay. Paid vacation. Okay. Paid sick time.
Right there too.
Okay, interesting. All right. Very good. Paid PTO. Okay. Paid time off. All right. This is good because it helps me to understand kind of where you're going to be starting with some of your work to get compliant. Okay. All right. Thank you. Let me start with just a little bit of a story. This is from the Wall Street Journal here just very recently, something that
Might be a silly question, but what's your distinction between PTO and vacation?
paid time off often instead of vacation, which is for, you know,
Doctors or,
Yeah.
yeah.
But PTO generally, lots of times employers have PTO policies that are meant to cover everything. Vacation, sick kids.
Yep.
So it's a discretionary use sort of thing.
Got it.
Okay, thanks. All right, so this comes from the Wall Street Journal, just here recent, and Pat, you discovered this story. It was a gorgeous day. I just wasn't in the mood to work. And so the story that is told through the Wall Street Journal is, you know, American employees, especially younger ones, are actually using their sick days today and not feeling bad about it either, okay? One project manager in Chicago told the Wall Street Journal he used to power through illnesses, but after getting laid off, he takes sick days at his new job without hesitation. So we were talking a little earlier about, I did a workshop here before the pandemic. Since the pandemic, workplaces have dramatically changed, okay? We all know that. And one of the things that a state senator told me, and also another state senator told a colleague, is that the intent of this legislation is a couple of things: to attract staff, to retain staff, and we all know that those are some of our biggest challenges right now, and to improve the health of our workplace. Because sometimes what happened during the pandemic was that people came to work sick, and then everybody was sick, right? So there's a variety of reasons for this legislation, but those are the two primary reasons. Minnesota is not the first, okay? In fact, coming in 2024, Illinois is coming on, but the purple states, Patriot is just a software company that does paychecks. And you can see the purple denoted states are ones that have some sort of paid sick leave laws, okay? And I'm going to talk in two different terms today. I'm going to talk about paid sick time, earned sick and safe time, okay? But there's another statute coming our way in 26, and that's paid family medical leave, okay? There were two laws that passed in legislation, and I'll talk about the differences here in a minute. So the agenda today is we're going to do an overview and the basics of what the statute actually says. And then I want to make it easy on you as an employer. There are notices that you should already be giving out. Maybe you are, maybe you're not, because my experience with small businesses is a lot of times they don't know some of these things that they're supposed to be given out to new hires. So we are going to talk about how you combine the things that are required under Minnesota sick and safe law with some of the other notices that are required that you should be doing. But we're going to talk about how we make it easy. Because we've got the wage theft notice that was part of a law that was passed right before the pandemic, and I think that was really the reason why a lot of people don't know about it. Okay, wage theft, Minnesota, it's called Pregnant Worker Fairness Act, PWFA. That was passed back in the spring along with these sick time legislation. but there's a notice that goes with that. And we'll talk about how you implement that along with all this other. We're going to talk about the payroll requirements, what notices you have to provide when you give out paychecks, what needs to be on the paychecks. We're going to talk about handbooks and posters. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end, and we'll make sure you have the resources. So again, I think from working with a variety of employers so far in this, and I had a couple of employers, one very complicated municipal city, lots of unions and lots of different kinds of benefit plans. We've been working on this for like 3 months already. But I think one of the things that we learned coming out of that experience is you got to keep it really, really simple. Because what goes through your head is you'll go, what if this? What if that? What if something else? So concentrate on really the basics as we go through this. If you already, now this is one thing that I think most people understand. If you already provide PTO or paid sick leave, you're not required to provide additional time. However, you must meet the minimum requirements that are set forth in the statute. Okay, so even if you offer this paid time, you've got to make sure that that paid time you're offering, the way it works, the way it's provided, meets the minimum requirements of the state law. Okay, and I had a lawyer describe it to me as there are two parts of those requirements of the state law. One is substantive, which means you got to provide the amount of time, okay? That's the minimum requirement. And the other part is procedural. So it's how you make it available, how they go about using it, blah, 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 okay? So there's two parts to this, but do not confuse earned sick and safe time with paid family medical leave, which comes in January of 26, okay? You'll hear more about it, I think, in the next couple of years, but that is a state-run program. It will work like unemployment, okay? And honestly, I just worked with an employer last year in Massachusetts where they have state-run paid family medical leave. That's for extended leave, okay? But it really works well, because it's just like unemployment. You have the employee fill out the papers, you submit it or they submit it to the state does the qualification process, you get an email and they tell you how long they're going to be out. Okay, so there's more to follow on that, but that's for extended illness. And what you're going to want to do as an employer is make sure you understand how you assess your employees for the cost of that if you want to pass it along. Just like unemployment tax, you can take that out from a withholding standpoint. There's going to be a limit you can take out, but you can take that out so that you're paying into the state-run program and they're paying, just like unemployment. Okay? All right. So but set that aside for now. All right. So here are the basics of earned sick and safe time. First of all, it applies, this is what makes it really different. The first thing that makes it different from any other city statute in the state is that it applies to employers that have one employee or more. I mean, there's no like threshold 5, 10, 20, okay, like some of these other city statutes. One employee or more, you have to do this. It doesn't include the federal government. It doesn't, if you have temp workers that are actually working, not for you, but are working for an agency, a staffing agency, they're the employers, the employees of the staffing agency, okay? Those are the only real exceptions. But employee, and this is something to take note of, because I know we have a lot of seasonal employees here in Cook County. Employee means anyone, temporary, seasonal, part-time, paid interns, any of those classifications are covered by this statute, who perform work for your business for 80 hours or more in a year. 80 hours or more in a year, they're covered. Now, here's an example of a question I got two different answers for, okay, from the state. But I'm going to illustrate why it's probably not a real big deal, okay? So if you've got a seasonal employee that finally works for you, they're deemed seasonal, okay? They come back and forth, you know, or they're just hired for a few months of the year. Once they work 80 hours, what happens? Do they start, are they then qualified and start accruing or getting ESST? Or do you go back to their hire date? Okay? So what you will find out is that when we go through the calculations, it's a difference of about 1 hour, 2 hours, a couple hours. So I say, go back to their start date. It's a difference of 1 or 2 hours, it's not that big a deal, okay? Oh, I forgot something. It doesn't include independent contractors, but if you have somebody like a seasonal employee that keeps coming back to work for you, you know, they go back to school or whatever, and then they come to work again. If they come back within 180 days or 6 months, essentially, you have to reinstate whatever their balance is. So this is an illustration where you got to start keeping good records, if you're not already. Okay, so this is how the accruals work. And you actually, as an employer, have a couple of different options. We will have a quick discussion of why you might want to pick one over the other. But you have an option of doing an accrual-based providing of time, or you can do a front-loading approach. So if you do an accrual, this is every paycheck, whatever your paychecks are, once a month, once every other week, right? A lot of people pay bi-weekly. You have to provide 1 hour of earned sick and safe time at their regular rate of pay, just like it was a working hour, for every 30 hours they work. Okay, so you got a full-time employee that works 40 hours that week, they're obviously going to get one hour first week of payroll, and then you get 1 hour the second week. Okay, so 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. Maximum of 48 hours in a year. Okay, so essentially 6 days. That's all you have to provide. And you may already be providing this in PTO or other kinds of paid time. We'll talk about that in a minute. The maximum year over year banked, okay, unused ESST is 80 hours. Okay, you have to allow them to bank that much at any given time. It's obviously not going to happen the first year, but the second year, if they don't use anything, by the time, you know, early part of the year, spring, early summer, they're going to have 80 hours, and then they don't, if they haven't used any, they don't go any further. Okay, maximum bank never goes beyond 80. Front loading is where you say, first year, okay, let's say your year is a calendar year, 1/1. First year, you give them automatically in their account, they've got 48 hours to use immediately. Okay. And then they have to, or you can do, the second option for front loading is you can give them 80 hours. But you give them 80 hours each year thereafter unless they cash out ESST. So if you front load 48 hours and they don't use it at the end of the year, you got to get out. Okay. If you front load 80 hours and they don't use it, you don't have to pay it out. Go figure. All I can figure is that if you give 48 hours of earned sick and safe time, and at the beginning of the year, you're basically in what a lawyer would call constructive receipt. That's your money, that's your pay, that's your time, that's your money, and I owe it to you at the end of the year if you don't use it. Okay? But if you go to the max and just give them 80 hours out of the blocks, you don't have to pay anything out if they leave. But if they use it, obviously you gotta pay it out. If they use it on January 2nd, well, they won't have an hour accrued yet, but if they use it early in the year, you gotta pay it. Okay? I'm gonna come back to this in a minute. Here are the eligible uses, all right? So the reason why eligible uses is important, and we have a bibliography for you. You've got the actual state law, right? Here's why the eligible uses are important. If you've got any other kind of paid time, you're gonna have to make sure, and if you wanna use it to credit yourself for ESSP, I'm giving the amount of time, you gotta make sure it can be used for this use, right? So here are the uses. It's for employees' own illness, injury, etc., preventive care, going to the doctor, care for a family member for same reasons, domestic violence for safety reason, employee, family member, closure of a business due to bad weather, okay? Or an employee's need to care for a family member whose school or place of care has been closed due to weather or other public emergency. Kids went home from Great Expectations, I don't know, a few months ago, because, I don't know, they hit a water line or something. You have to go get your kid. You got ESST time if it's happening next year, right? Okay, inability to work or telework because of public emergency related to a communicable disease like COVID, obviously. Health authorities have determined that the presence would jeopardy it of an employee or family member in the community would jeopardize the health of others because of the exposure relative to communicable disease. So this is lifted right through from the language of the statute. And then here's the definition of family members, a very broad definition, okay? And it's a child, a spouse, a sibling, grandparent, niece, child-in-law, sibling in-law, spouse or registered domestic partner, anybody that's related that is the equivalent of a family relationship. And then finally, I highlighted this because this is different, right? Up to one individual designated annually. Okay, so I work for your organization and I have a neighbor, elderly neighbor that I take to the doctor, once a month or once a week or something like that. I can use my ESST for that. Now, I did read some state guidance that they were recommending, and I would recommend this to any employer, is that once it's used, that you have record in terms of who they're, by name, who they're using it for, right? So we don't have multiple people, right? But they have the ability to designate an individual annually. So this was kind of the first thing out of the blocks that I heard from my small businesses. I provide paid leave that exceeds the minimum time requirements, 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, that's 48 in a year. Okay. I exceed that, so I really don't have to do anything. Probably wrong. You probably still have some work to do. If you offer PTO, and there were some people in the room that offer PTO, paid time off, which is discretionary use for anything, right? You either need to add additional time or explain in writing to your employees, because again, a big part of this law is communication. Explain in writing to your employees so they're very clear that you consider the first 48 hours of their PTO used in a year to meet your obligations under the statute. I'll give you some language for that. That's recommended by a lawyer colleague. Now, I had one employer that actually has PTO in excess, but decided because they had bumped up their PTO during the pandemic, and they had told the employees, we may have to bump this back down. They were, and now, whether they remember that or not, I don't know, but because of that, they decided that they didn't want to mess around with this bucket thing, and your PTO is considered your ESST and all that. They just said, we're gonna offer 1 hour for every 30 up to 48 ESST, we're gonna bump back the PTO a little bit, we're gonna have both. Okay, so that's an example of some of the decisions you gotta make relative to what you currently have. Do you offer sick leave? Because if you offer sick leave, you have to make sure, and that's why that previous slide for uses is available by policy or practice for all the things that are listed for appropriate use. Okay, does that make sense? So if you have a sick leave policy that's just restricted to the individual, let's say, you got to make sure you expand it to include family members, one person named every year, you know, that sort of thing. So that's why you got to really do a side-by-side. Do we have a side-by-side handout?
I don't think so.
What I would recommend, and I've got your email address, I can send that out. I forgot to notice that we didn't have that. Anyway, I just have a little handout that you can take. Here are the basic requirements of the statute. Here's my policy. You can kind of do a side-by-side comparison. When I got involved with a really complex municipal employer, that's how we did it. Because we had to go through all the union contracts and land on and make sure, you know, it all worked appropriately. And then my next step. So I will send that out to you through Kelsey, so you'll have that. And it's just a little tool that might be helpful. So start by looking at your current policies and practices. And this is the language that I mentioned, the first 48 hours of PTO used every year counts as earned sick and safe time in compliance with Minnesota statute. Now, you know, the downside to this, and I think why the illustration of the employee that decided to bump PTO back a little bit because they'd already talked about it and then just give ESST. It kept it a lot cleaner from a policy standpoint, but I think they also thought that if I tell you, you get PTO and, you know, it's discretionary use, but if I tell you that the first 48 hours I'm going to count against you for earned sick and safe time, and I just took a vacation, that feels a little fun, right? You kind of have to do that unless you're going to, you know, offer a second bank. You got to make sure that it's communicated how you are compliant. And so I think that's another part of the reason why that employer made that decision. Okay, here's ESST use. And I'm going to come back to accrual versus front loading here in just a second. Unlike other ordinances, and this is where it comes in where you're doing your side-by-side with your policy, okay? Look at how your policy or practice you offer sick time or vacation. There's no 90-day waiting period for use, okay? So once it goes in your bank, 1 hour for every 30 hours, it has to be available for use, which means that if you have, okay, here's how this works. You have an introductory period, you got a probation period, you can't use paid time off till they pass that. That doesn't work with the SST, okay? With me? That makes sense? Okay. Must begin to accrue at the commencement of employment and must be used and may be used as it's accrued. And then here's another little kicker. You have to be able to offer it in the smallest increment of time that your payroll tracks. And a lot of employers, you know, do the rounding up, although that's kind of, there's been some legal cases, the big one down in Missouri, that they're getting challenged on their big healthcare system, getting challenged on their use of the rounding up principle for every 15 minutes. You know, if you come in and you're under that, you know, it rounds back to the beginning of the hour. It's closer to the 15, you get rolled up. And they're getting challenged because there's a big difference in pay if you looked at it over a year or two. So anyway, if you have you have a POS system that they clock into, or they're doing a manual recording, you have to be able to use they have to be able to use ESST in the smallest increment of time. This is what the statute language says, that is tracked by the employer's payroll system, provided it's not more than 4 hours. Now, okay, we have some exempt salaried people that, you know, if they use PTO, they have to use it. They can't use it in less than 4 hour blocks. That's kind of a common policy out there. You can't go any beyond that in terms of increments of time. All right, so back to the options. Again, I just want to reiterate the basic substantive part of this implementation is 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, maximum of 48 hours earned per year. If they don't use it, they have to be able to carry that over into the next year. But that unused ESST bank cannot exceed 80 hours. That is a threshold. It can never go. Now, if you have another policy about PTO, you know, they can have up to 200 hours and it'll be paid out. I mean, you know, we have some pretty generous policies out there in some cases. You know, you can go beyond this. But when we're talking ESST, this is the basic requirements, is that you don't exceed 80. You can front load 48 hours for the year. Again, it has to be immediately available for use. And you have to pay it out. Or you can front load 80, provided beginning of January, here you got 80 hours to use, bank. Use it as you need it, okay? You don't have to pay it out at the end of that accrual year. I'm going to talk about what an accrual year is, or it's basically the employer deemed year. So what is better, the accrual method or front loading? I know what I personally think, but I think what you got to think about, because there are some organizations that just don't do this based on paychecks, you know, or accruals. They just do, and there are several that I've worked with here, both locally and regionally, that just provide a bank of time, like maybe middle of the year. So I have one employer that puts PTO based on number of hours worked in at the middle of the year. Well, you got to think about, if you're going to use any kind of front loading method, think about how you currently are providing paid time off. Think about your turnover rate. If you got a high turnover rate, I wouldn't recommend putting 48 hours in the bank right away, or 80. But you got to think about your ability to track it in your payroll system, because we're going to talk about that in more depth here. But you have to be able to show the employer or the employee what they've got. Okay. Your ability to afford a lump sum payment. Remember that this paid time is at the same rate of pay that they get normal. Okay, so you got to be able to afford that payout at the end of the year if you're going to do the 48 hours accrual. There was a question that came up about seasonal workers. Does it matter if they're terminated? Well, no, it's kind of like unemployment. Probably not. If they're terminated or lose significant hours, they're eligible for unemployment insurance benefits. I don't think that it really matters, because once they're rehired, you're going to have to restore them anyway. So termination or not probably doesn't really matter.
So a seasonal, you're not obligated, say that they work 6 months, you're not, if it's an accrual, you're not gonna pay them that on their last check. If they're,
Does it come back to work for you? You got to restore it. If they come back within 6 months.
but if you front loaded, you would, and then you'd be back to square one when they come back 6 months.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Good question. All right. Okay, here's some more on, this is procedural notice and record keeping. Now, the state hasn't provided all the documents. They've been starting with these FAQs, and they have offered like multiple workshops. I went to the first one, and It was online, it had like 800 people online, but it covered the basics and people didn't really get their questions answered, so some came away with, that was the origination of that question I asked. Some employers came away more confused than when they started. But there are things that you have to do to provide appropriate notice. And if you have a handbook, okay, many employers have handbooks. I always tell my employers, you want 3 things to protect you in the event you get challenged or you get a claim through the human rights that you fired them and you've been discriminatory or whatever. You better have 3 things at your disposal, because having dealt with enough of these investigators, is what they ask you for. They ask you for a job description. They ask you for your policy or your handbook, and they ask you for a performance review or when you had a sit down with them for corrective action. Now, if you got that and you've got that all tidied up, then, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape unless you did violate the law, right? But so many employers do operate with handbooks or distribute policies. You've got to make sure that these changes are represented in those. If you want to ask for, the law is very specific. If you want to ask for notice, I need to use ESST, then you have to put it in your policy book, your handbook. You can require 7 days notice for foreseeable, doctor's appointment, something like that, right? Non-foreseeable, you can require that they give you notice as soon as practicable. And to require notice, you must have a written policy. So I've written that right in the policies I've done for handbooks. Here's a couple of caveats, and I see these in handbooks and I see these in policies. You can't do it with the ESST, okay? You can't require the employee to find a replacement worker. And that, we have plenty of employers that do that if you can't work your schedule. You can't charge points or in any kind of fashion have punitive action as a result, provide punitive action as a result of using ESST. Can't charge them points, can't discipline them.
So safe to say it probably shouldn't even come up in like a review.
Absolutely. I wrote a policy yesterday for an employer that actually, it was their attendance policy, and it was very important and easily abused at this particular organization. But we wrote it very specific that the discipline would not pertain to any use of this and the required time, that is available to you. So we just called it right out right there. Because I don't think anybody wants to not have an attendance policy, right? Anyway, all right, so those are some important things about procedural. And they're, of course, entitled to, you can't fire them, and they have to keep their health insurance going and so forth. Those are kind of typical with any kind of leave. Now, you can ask for documentation. Lots of policies say if you're gone for 3 days or more, you have to give us a doctor's note, right? Okay. You can do that, but you have to say it in your handbook, and you have to understand that reasonable documentation may not be what you think it is, okay? Because the FAQs and the law specifically, says that it's reasonable, and that can be by an attestation from an employer. So you have a form, or an employee, you have a form to give it to them. They're using the ESST, they've been out for 3 days or more. And it says, I certify here that my time that I was out is for a reason that is covered by ESST statute 181, blah, blah, blah. And you're gonna have to accept that.
No matter what.
Right, but don't fail to ask them for that attestation. Sometimes there is, with some people, there's magic asking them to put it in writing and sign it. Not that they know what's gonna happen if they falsify it, but it can serve as a detriment, right? Or deterrent, I should say. All right, now we're gonna move on to pay stubs, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. And we go for an hour, right? Hour and a half, okay, so we're gonna have, we'll wrap up in plenty of time for that. But this is a little bit of a foggy area, and I had one state labor, Department of Labor person tell me that, yes, it has to say on pay stub, ESST. Can't just say PTO or sick time. All right, and this, because it has quotes on it, you can see that this is lifted from the statute. On the pay stub, for every pay period, you need to show the total number of ESST hours accrued and available, or that's front-loaded, and available, or accrued and available for use, and the total number of hours used during the pay period. Okay, this is me with the question, if they show that PTO on the pay stub, do they have to label it ESST? And the state investigator, I left her name off. Maybe she doesn't want to be published. Yes, that's correct. Needs to be labeled ESST accrued and ESST used. All right. So I think there is a little bit of a confusion, but I think you have to go back to the intent of the law. And the intent of the law is to provide this time for employees and to help them understand how they use it, how it's made available to them, and how much time they have at any given point in time. So I think that would tell us if that's the intent, you got to show it on the paycheck. Now, here's some suggestions. Here's an old pay stub example, and some people use QuickBooks, so I showed it. I know you can't see it very well, but maybe you can see a little better in your handout.
Not really.
Okay, all right, well, sorry. Couldn't make it any bigger and make it make any sense, but here's a pay stub that just shows benefits used and available, sick and vacation. Used during the pay period, available, okay? This example on the left comes from the League of Minnesota Cities, and I said I had a city client that was doing this, and here's where you can see that, you know, you see their vacation, but you see how it's changed over here to sick leave, which they are now, because of their contract responsibilities, to have so much sick leave, which really exceeds the amount required under the law for ESST. They chose to, the first 30 hours of every pay period, they're going to dump into ESST. The rest of it that is available to them based on their contract benefits goes in what they're calling traditional sick time. Okay, now they also had a caveat in their union contract that when a person left, that anything that was available left over got moved into an HRA or some kind of health reimbursement account. Okay, so they have to marry this up when somebody leaves. They have to marry those two things up and make it available. But right now they're saying, so that you can see we're compliant, we're going to separate it out. Now, if it were me, and what we will do in our small business, because my husband and I own a UPS franchise too, UPS store, we're going to have our payroll vendor put in, call it PTO/ESST, or in our case, so that's what I'm recommending, is that however you are thinking of it, you show it on the paycheck, okay? That's the basic requirement. All right, remember I talked about accrual years and so forth. This is the finer points of how a year is defined. Year under the law means a consecutive and regular 12-month period as determined by the employer and clearly communicated to each employee of that employer. All right, you get to name it though, okay? You can name it my anniversary year. I would never do that because that would mean I would have to keep track of everybody's anniversary year, right? But some people, based on how you set up your system, may want to do that. Could do a fiscal year. But most employers or many employers are going to find it easier to use a calendar year. And here's a caveat to it. The law says you have to start offering this 1/1 of 24. So why would you use a calendar year? You know, I mean, that one really didn't make total sense to me. So anyway, but you have to define what the accrual year is as you are providing information to employees. So you have to clearly communicate that. Now, when you look at your policies and practices and your communication, there are some other things. And I'm going to go over your handouts because these documents are all out there now for you to use. But the fine print says you can't discipline, discharge, penalize, or interfere with their ability to use ESST. So obviously that was back to that attendance policy, right? It's unlawful to report or threaten to report their citizenship or immigration status. You don't need to the employee doesn't need to explicitly refer to the ESST Act to be protected, from retaliation. This is the big hitter. If you don't do this, it's $10,000 fine per violation. And a consultant I work with said, to her clients, hey, that's for every employee. Think about it. If they interpret it that way, that could be pretty expensive. Employees who allege the employer has violated this act have 3 years to start action. And you can't contract with an entity, in a contractor kind of role that's violated this policy. Okay. So here's the info that needs to be contained within the notice. They're entitled to ESST, the amount of time they're going to accrue, the accrual year, the terms of when they can use it, the copy of the policy that you have providing the notice to use it, an explanation that retaliation is prohibited, and the mechanism for filing a complaint. This is where this business I said early on, there's some other notices you need to be given out, and you make sure you're giving out and combine it all together and make it easy on yourself, okay? So you are supposed to be giving, and this is for one employee or more, got one employee or more, every time you hire someone, you are required by law in Minnesota to give them a wage theft notice. What is a wage theft notice? It's over here on the left. It's a notice that's out there on the Department of Labor's site. You've got a copy of it in your handout. It is via a law that was passed July 1st of 2019. It basically informs them as a new employee what their legal name of their employer is, how frequently they're going to get paid, okay? Whether they are eligible for overtime, their rate of pay, any sick leave or paid vacation or other paid time off. It has a little arrow there because effective 1/1 of 24, you're going to want to make sure that contains ESST or however you're meeting that statute, that you're informing them that that's available to them. Deductions that are going to come out of their paycheck, like if you have benefits or something, to provide that. Are there other questions that are popping up? Are you saving them? Okay, great. Colin, I'll come back to you here in a few minutes. And any other questions that have popped up that I haven't seen. And then this is the important part, because when you get into these notices, folks, you need to make sure the employees sign and you have a signed copy so you can validate that you've done it. Okay. So wage theft notice has to be given to every new employee, and I'll answer this question right now. If there is a change, they get a raise, you change a payroll provider, you change the frequency of You know, you add ESST, any changes, you have to reissue that. Okay? So remember, if you give them a raise, and that's not uncommon, in an increase, you got to reissue it because it's got different information on it. So this is something you just want to really get in the habit of, because otherwise you're like, oh my God, I forgot to do it. All right. Now, this is wage theft, and how it changes with ESST is one piece. But also in your handout, in your packet, you have two other notices. Remember I talked about PWFA. Whether it's a female or whether they're pregnant or anything, doesn't matter. It goes to every new employee. This notice over here, and you've got it in your handbook, in your packet, yeah. I can see that. Nursing mothers, lactating employees, and pregnancy accommodations employee notice. Okay, so that's another notice you got to get out when you hire someone. Now, the third notice, and I thought maybe you could do it front and back, but the ESST notice that just got published, it must have just got published this week because I went out there, it kept saying coming soon. It's now available, but they gave it to you as a template. So if you look at that, which, yeah, thank you. It looks like this, it's got the red lines in there, okay, I think most people have that. When this got published, it's given as a template, which means that you're supposed to, where the red is, you're supposed to put what applies to you. Okay. But this is your notice. So again, 3 notices, wage theft. This one on ESST, Pregnant Worker Fairness Act. Okay. And there's one other thing, and based on wage theft, you know, I've worked with a lot of employers on wage theft, and when it first came out, you know, there were a few FAQs online. Well, I got in there recently, and there's just like a bazillion FAQs about wage theft in there. So the state is adding to it to clarify. So I just make sure you have, like, you know where to go to that state site, and we've got the resources in your bibliography to go to the state site. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just know where you can go and keep up to date on it. I don't think the poster is out there yet that you have to post in the workplace. I don't think it's out there yet, but it will be soon. So that would be the fourth thing. All right, so now we're going to get to questions here.
We have a whole pile of them online.
Okay, good.
I can start with the first one.
Well, hang on just one second, one more slide.
Okay.
And that is, if you have, and I'm going to send you this spreadsheet via your email. If you have current policies, I would start by doing that side-by-side comparison. Because the handout has just a little, the basics that I just went through over on one side, your policy, and then next steps. So you can do kind of an action plan. So go ahead. And I can help you with your policy language. I do charge, you know, an hourly fee for service. But if you want to put this together, figure out how you want to do it, it really shouldn't cost you all that much for me to take a look at it. Just make sure that you've got things covered. Go ahead.
Questions about use during the weather events. If there's a weather event, what happens? You can talk about the SST in relation to weather.
Well, you know, I would want to look at my current policy about weather. Because do they have, for example, if you're a restaurant, do they have a number to call that if there's bad weather to find out? I mean, how are you closing now? I mean, there's two issues here. One's how you use ESST, but, you know, how are your employees informed if you're having a weather event and whether or not they should come to work? You got to think about that. And if you close your business or they don't feel that they can come to work, it is a legitimate use of ESST. Does that answer the question?
Sounds good.
Ask it again if I didn't answer it.
Can a minor employee sign an attestation or must it be done by a parent or guardian?
I don't know the answer to that. I would think if they're your employee. We don't know that a minor. I can investigate that.
Let's take that offline and we can send it back out if we can find an answer to it.
I'm not sure we're gonna find an answer to that one, but we might, you never know. I think once they're your employee and you're providing benefits, then,
They're representing themselves.
yeah.
Is ESST able to be used above a normal 40-hour week to get overtime? Example, employee works their 5 days for 40 hours, but has 8 hours available and went to a doctor appointment on one of their days off. Can they claim those 8 hours and get paid 48 hours now?
I think the answer to that question, I think there are some that are similar to that out on FAQs. Let's reserve that one too for our follow-up. But I think if your policies, there's a lot of answers to questions that come up like this in these what if arena that refers you back to your own policy. If you would allow that to occur, I mean, think about it. They're burning it up. It's theirs. I mean, if they want to burn it up that way, right? I suppose they could burn it up that way.
But I think the distinction is, do you have
You
to
have
count
to
it
pay overtime, you have to count it as hours worked. Yeah. I'll do some follow-up on that one though too, just so you have it in email.
And Colin, I will encourage you to read off your last question and then elaborate on the one that you were asking about whether, if you are comfortable doing so.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can do.
Okay. So I run an outdoor reservation-based business. So if we have certain weather events like lightning or high winds, we have to close. My question is more to the effect of, does the employee have to opt into the use of ESST in that situation, or should I be paying it out automatically? I assume they need to opt to use it in that situation.
Again, that is back to your normal practices and policies. You know, if they don't want to opt, if they don't want to use ESST, then I would assume they're unpaid. Unless you have some sort of policy where you pay them if that happens.
No, they would be unpaid. I'm just wondering
Then
if,
then it would seem to me that, and I haven't seen this question specifically asked, but it would seem to me that they don't have to use ESST.
but the option is available to them if they want to.
It's available, yeah.
Okay. And then sort of
I think
related,
you have to be careful, and it's a good question because I think you do have to be careful about requiring use of ESST.
right? I do have one question that's somewhat related because the business I run is reservation based. If we don't receive reservations for a certain time period, say at the end of the day, and we close early due to that, that's not listed under the ESST eligible uses, but would I need to consider that if it's a change to regular business hours?
Well, that's not exactly under the definitions though.
Right.
Yeah. I'm not sure that that is necessarily a use of ESST, Colin.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. But you would have to examine your policies currently for that.
Right.
But it doesn't
Thank you.
meet the definition. It doesn't meet the definition. Okay. But
I think we're gonna stop with
Oh.
that, and open it up to the group and then see more questions about. Any questions that you guys have here?
Does it have to be on the pay stub, or can you track it in a separate system?
the law says pay stub.
Interesting.
Now, I do have employers that are having difficulty meeting that because, you know, they use an outside payroll provider. The payroll provider isn't up to speed on that. They haven't figured out how to do it quick or whatever. It's so, obviously you're gonna have to keep some manual records, but the intent of the law is to be is that they always know what has been used during the pay period, what's available
Yeah.
for their use, and the law says that's via a pay stub. And so I think you have to, as an employer, figure out how you're gonna ultimately get that done. But in the short term, you're gonna have to think about other communication vehicles if you have a payroll provider that's not doing it yet. Now, the payroll providers, I mean, you already saw that there's up to like 18 states now. So if you're using a national payroll provider, that's what we use in my small business. You know, they are much more sophisticated because they're seeing these things come out via state laws. But the law is very specific that they have to be able to see it on their pay stubs. It says that. Yeah. What else? Yes, ma'am.
So the basis is the 48 hours per year that we give the employee is over and above the PTO. Right?
Depends on, well, if your PTO already meets the requirement, it's enough to meet that requirement, then you're going to have to let your employees know that they're not going to be adding unless you want to add more. If you want to use what you're providing now as PTO to satisfy it, the requirement, as long as you meet all those other standards, showing on payroll, not having restricted the use during the probation period, all those things, provided all that's true, then my recommendation is that you say in your policy, we consider the PTO offered, you know, as an employer, we consider that to satisfy the minimum requirement under ESST statute 180. You got it.
Okay.
But you gotta communicate that, or otherwise I think people are gonna come back to you and say, you gotta give that to me.
And so Rabina, let's go back to your very first slide. It says, this does not add additional time.
It's not meant to require you to give additional time if you are already giving at least that amount.
Okay.
At least that amount. And again, you know, it's the 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. That's the definition of at least as much. So if you pay differently or you provide PTO differently, you can't say that, you know, and let's say you give PTO, you know, periodically, you dump PTO in your bank, or it's after 6 months of employment or something. You can't say you're satisfying the statute, it's not 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. You gotta give it, you gotta meet that requirement if you're gonna use your current policy.
Okay.
Amber, you have a question?
Can you just explain again how it works with the vacation time? It sounded like you needed to use the ESST before you using PTO. Can you explain that part again?
You can consider that you can do the same thing, as you've done with vacation. You gotta meet all those requirements I just referenced again. So your vacation would have to be given out at least 1 hour for every 30 hours they work. You can't just say, I'll give you vacation after the first year and call it meeting the statute requirements.
I thought there was a piece that you were talking about that said that they needed to use, like if they were accruing PTO or ESST and maybe some extra PTO. Wasn't there something that you said that was the ESST would need to get used first? Did I hear you say that?
I would say if you don't offer anything other than vacation, your vacation meets the minimum requirements as required by law, 1 hour for 30 hours worked, given each paycheck. And that you allow it to be used for all the things that are required by statute. You could say, just like in that statement I gave about PTO, we consider the first 48 hours of your vacation used as satisfying this requirement.
Okay, even if it's not really sick time. Okay.
I think she's referring to when you had the slide up that had ESST first and then below it sick time. So that's what she's referring to.
Like you'd have to, a lot of employers let you bank more vacation, though. You know what I mean, roll over more than 80 hours sometimes, so you don't have to kind of think about that too.
Right,
Separating for that reason.
yeah, you're gonna have to say it in your policy in terms of your payouts.
Yeah.
Because we consider the first, you know, 48 hours to be satisfied this ESST requirement. You know, we're gonna pay out the remaining or something like that. Now, you could pay it out, all out, because you're giving obviously more. There's nothing in the statute that says you can't do more. Or provide a more generous benefit, or pay out those 200 hours of PTO that we consider satisfying our ESST requirement. You don't have to say, I'm not gonna pay out, you know, this accrued time when you leave. You can do something more generous, but you can't do anything less.
I think I'm confused now on when you have to pay out. I know you have to pay out if you front load with 40, but I thought you said a seasonal, you don't have to if they come back.
You have to reinstate it. If they come back to work and they have anything remaining in their bank, and they come back within 6 months.
So they'll eventually get paid that if they take it, right?
Right,
Yeah,
yeah,
but
but
if
you don't
you-
have to pay
If
it
you
out.
put in your 2 weeks notice and you have a balance, you should be paid out even if you're not front
No,
loaded.
no, no,
Oh,
no.
okay.
I'm just saying you have to reinstate it. If they come back to work for you, you have to have good records. You don't have to pay it out when they leave, but if they come back to work for you within 6 months, you have to make it available to them again. They've got 30 hours left in their bank.
It goes back to record keeping. If we haven't all picked that up by now, record keeping is gonna be critical. And giving notices out to employers and having communication and having them sign these documents is going to be critical to protect yourself from future litigation. That's really what this all amounts to, is getting, and I'm sorry, I'm this old, a 3-ring binder together or a digital file somewhere, that you have it all together so that if you're called to show any of the documents that we've been talking about, you can pull them up and show them, and the employee has a copy. Because this communication issue is the big piece. Everybody should know, it should be, I hate the word, transparent. Yes.
A well-used word.
Yes.
I'm feeling like I'm leaving you confused, so if you want to talk. after
Yeah, I
that.
guess I just don't understand the obligation.
For
There was one
seasonal
slide,
PTO.
there was one slide that you said if you front load, you're obligated to pay out their balance of ESST. And now,
At 48 hours. If you front load 48 hours,
so you're only obligated to pay out balances if you front load, but if it's on an accrual, you're never obligated if
That's
they
right.
leave.
that's right. But if they come back within,
Yeah, 6
you
months.
have to reinstate it.
Okay.
You okay now?
Yep.
All right.
So if
Accrual method, you don't pay out.
Yep,
Accrual method, you don't pay out.
that makes sense.
So if an employee is on an accrual method and they leave the company, what happens to that accrual time? Just rolls over to the next company or?
Oh, no.
How does that-
No,
Okay,
So
so,
they're done. You don't have to pay it out.
okay, so
But
if
if
they're
you
terminated
rehire
or
them-
they leave, or then that ESST that they've accrued is just negligible? It's just gone.
It's a write-off, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
You have
if they
no
come back-
obligation.
Okay, but if they come back, then it's reinstated.
Right.
Okay.
So if it's a seasonal job, it's probably better to do it that way, like a accrual.
Did I hear that?
I think accrual is actually for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
So-
But if they are seasonal and they left and they accrued 20 hours, say, and then they come back for the following season, do you start them at 20 or all over again?
No, they have to reinstate their balance.
Repeat that question.
Yes, so I have a seasonal employee and they come back they leave me, go back to school or whatever. And they had a balance of 20 hours. They come back to work for me the next season. Within 180 days, I have to reinstate that balance. and pick it up again to add to it.
But at 181 days, it would start at
Zero. Yep. 180 days is the magic.
So I'm hearing a lot of people here kind of, and things you're saying suggest that accrual makes a lot more sense. Why would we front load? Is that just because we're too lazy to do the bookkeeping of the accrual method? Or what would be an advantage of front loading?
What scenario would that be a best option in?
Oh, well, I do have a few employers that they don't exactly call it front loading, but they do a dump of PTO at a certain time of the year. Okay, so that it's not going in they're not adding PTO, vacation, sick every paycheck based on how, so you get more and more, the longer you work there, right? You're building up your balances. I do have employers that for whatever reason, a lot of it is what you just said. They don't have the means to keep track of the accrual every pay period. They just say, I'm gonna monitor your balance, and every 6 months, I'm gonna do a little window and I'm gonna drop PTO time in for you.
So does this not also mean that it depends on the type of business you're running? So if you have long-term employees that you know are going to be there or will be there or have been there for many years, the dump method kind of makes some sense because you don't have to, it's going to be used.
Yeah, it could be, yes, you might.
Because that's not necessarily our employee base here.
I honestly think it's more about your ability to do the record keeping.
Okay.
I think you nailed it.
Or kind of an incentive to say, because you could get hired and start accruing and have an emergency. And unless you front loaded them, they're kind of
That's true.
SOL.
Yeah.
Good point.
That is a very good point, but again, it really comes back to looking at what you're currently doing. And like putting this in place along with what you're currently doing. And unless you just want to, as long as you meet those minimum requirements, you don't have to give more, but you have to communicate it properly. Yes.
Now, if we satisfy the ESST by PTO,
Yes.
when they take time off, do they still need to let us know that it's ESST time? Do we
Well-
have to be able to show that out of their PTO, yes, she's used 40 hours of?
That's what if you say that I use my PTO offering as meeting the requirement because I'm not gonna add another pot of 48 hours, then yes, you have to be able to show, and you have to have a way of being able to communicate how much has been used and how much is available. That's why you kind of want to preface with that statement in your policy or your handbook or in your communication, that we offer a generous PTO program already. And we just want you to know we are not offering additional time, but we are using it to satisfy these requirements. So that means that even if you're taking vacation with that first 48 hours, we're still going to count it as ESST use.
Ravina, with that.
Because we said it was concurrent.
With that being said, is that when we had the time sheet that showed up, or the pay stub,
Yeah.
that had the 2 categories, even though it was definitely a PTO below it, does that help organize people so that they can feel like, for their staff, feels more comfortable, or like it's language they're all familiar using and can speak to positively? Like
If you separate it out,
yeah. Like, oh, of course we have that at our place of work, so that it's an easy plus.
well, that's why I would put PTO aside for ESST. The examples where you saw it separated out was because they were dropping it in the bank separately. They were saying, okay, of this pool, we'll drop this in here and this in here. But again, that you have to check to make sure you've met all the other requirements, and you've got to be able to keep those appropriate records.
So another question that came up in here.
Yeah.
Is it against statutes to offer a buyout if the time is not used, like offer a perfect attendance award for say $500?
Perfect attendance awards, there's something I read, and I think it's in one of those bibliographies. You've got a bibliography that refers you to a Roe law. Whatever that law group is, and I'm not familiar with them, they're not going to use down in cities, but they have just all kinds of information. I mean, they've got this one paper that's like 20 pages long. And it may have been there where I read, but when you start getting into perfect attendance awards and ESST, you're walking a fine line there because somebody's getting punished for using ESST. See what I'm saying?
So if you didn't call it a perfect attendance award though, you called it good employee service or something like that?
I think you gotta be careful about anything that is contradictory to their rights to use that time. I think you have to be super careful.
So Ravina, am I taking this whole conversation to mean that we all have to talk to our employees on January 1st about this new process?
Absolutely.
So we need to have employee meetings, we need to give out employee forms, we need to get things signed so that everybody's up to speed. So that's the important piece sometime in December before January 1st happens, or on January 2nd when everybody's back to work. But there is that requirement to communicate now. That's something we all have to get done.
Because that clock starts January 1.
Would you recommend doing it ahead of time and that it just activates?
Yeah.
The person?
Personally, I would, yeah. Yeah, and it's a really good question. A lot of the questions that you see in the FAQs will say, unless an employer's policies or practices offer something more generous, okay? You will see that caveat a lot in the FAQs, but also based on that retaliation and they can't suffer any consequences for using, that's where I think these perfect things come into play. And just like the example I gave you of, that doesn't mean that no employer has an attendance policy. If you have an attendance policy, talk about occurrences, points, anything else after ESST time has been used. You've got to call it out, otherwise they'll get you on that one.
Another question.
Yeah.
No, oh, no.
Oh, there was one that popped up. No. Oh, okay. All right. Yes.
So what if, your business is seasonal and you end, November 1st, and you're not gonna start the next season until June 1st? You still have to have everything in place? Because
You're closing your business.
the employees would be laid off, so they wouldn't be including anything.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't seen any questions like that, but my presumption is as long as a business is closed, you don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, if you laid off certain people and your business wasn't closed, yeah, that'd be a different thing.
Question though, so say your season ends on January 1st or December 31st, would it, if you were gonna be a seasonal change, would it be better just to end this on December 31st? And so that you could start fresh for the new season in the spring versus creating all this paperwork for 3 days?
Yeah. Yes, especially this year. All right, what else? We've got about 10 more minutes, or we can close early. Any other questions from Zoom?
The important thing to think about as you go through this, because as Romina and I have talked, this might make sense to everyone, it might, and there might be questions. That's why Romina is here to answer those questions. If we get enough of the same type of question, we may need to do this again with a different type of, different kind of format or whatever. But let us know where your questions are at, because the one thing we don't want to see is confusion among the ranks. One of the things I've learned about here in this small community is everybody chats. So if Amber says this to her employees today and Melissa doesn't, there's going to be conversation on the street, which will then be like telephone tag, and everybody will be getting it wrong. So we just need to adopt these policies make sure we've got them written, make sure we look at our handbooks and correct them. I mean, this is a good time of year to do all that cleanup work that we should be doing anyway. And so we're here to help. You can let me know as well. We'll see what we can do to make sure everybody's clear on this. But there is no skating on this. January 1st is the deal. And I would say this too, and this is my personal opinion, I haven't talked to her about this, it's only going to get more from now on. We're going to get more statutes like this. We're going to get more employee protections like this. Start right, finish right. If we don't start right, the bumps in the middle are miserable. So let's take this opportunity to get it right now and then just go on from here, because once 26 comes along, it's going to get more complex.
Yeah, because in 26, then you're gonna be digging into your payroll system and figuring out how you're gonna pass the costs along. So some of the cost of family medical leave, state-run family medical leave to your employers, and I think you can pass on 50% of the 0.07, whatever the calculation rate is that your business pays. But there'll be a lot more to follow on that, and probably individual business assessments as your accounts get set up. Because it'll be like unemployment. It'll look a lot like that.
So with that, I mean, you've got this family medical leave. There'll be a website and we'll have an account and we'll have to log in and we'll have to, just like we do with a lot of these other things, but there is nothing like that for ESST.
Correct.
That is on our own.
Bingo. That is an administrative responsibility and fiduciary responsibility of the employee.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, you all, I want to thank you for coming today online and in person. If you want to hang out longer, feel free to do so. Also, if you order lunch, please feel free to grab extras out of the space across the hall. Thank you guys for taking time today.
It's been great to meet you.